Hello and welcome back. In a previous video we took a deep dive into curves, and in this video we're going to look at 5 further aspects of working with curves that'll make your life a lot simpler. So let's dive in and get started. In our previous video looking at curves, we identified a major problem that affects all image editing software, not just curves but all tools in Photoshop and all other editing software, and that is, as we darken an image we increase the saturation, and as we lighten an image we decrease the saturation, and that's the opposite of how human vision works. So we end up with a result in some cases where the result you get doesn't look right. And let's have a look at this image that we worked with previously, and if we just simply added in a curves adjustment layer, and here I've added a fairly aggressive darkening curves adjustment, and you can see here that with it selectively masked over one half of her face, it's darkened her face, but it's also increased the saturation dramatically, and she looks like she's been in some sort of a brawl, and so that's not really what we want. And the same thing happens where we lighten part of the image. It's taken all of the colour out of her skin, her lips, and a lot of the colour out of her hair, and yet it's lightened. And again, I've used a fairly aggressive lightening curve. Now, with subtle adjustments, this isn't going to be a major problem, but when you start doing larger adjustments, you're going to get some unwanted effects. So how do we work around this? Well, one method is to use a different colour mode in your image editing, and if we go back to this same image where we've changed it from RGB to LAB color mode, and we do that by going to image mode and changing it from, normally it'll be an RGB color image, we can change it to LAB color, which is a different way of operating. And if we add our curves adjustment, we can see that yes, it's darkened and the effect is not as dramatic, but there is still a slight increase in saturation. If we go back to our first image, you'll see here the normal RGB image, the color saturation has increased dramatically. Using LAB color mode, it hasn't had as big an effect. Now, one problem with converting from RGB to LAB color is that you will lose some adjustments that you've made, and when you convert back to RGB mode you may get some unwanted effects. But certainly going to LAB mode will solve that problem partially. But we can do it without having to go to LAB mode and still working in RGB color mode, and that is, in this sort of situation where our color rendition is critical, we don't use a curves adjustment at all. What we will do is we will use a hue saturation adjustment layer, because HSL works in LAB mode so that we don't have the same dramatic color shifts. Now, I've previously created this, and if I reset everything to 0, you'll see hue saturation adjustment, no adjustments, but what I have done is I've changed the blend mode to multiply, and I've reduced the effectiveness of it. So let's go up to 100%. Still looks pretty horrible, just like the normal curves adjustment, but we've got other tools available to us in an HSL adjustment. Firstly, we can just wind back the saturation so that we, instead of getting that darkening and increase in saturation, we can drop it back, and then we can use the lightness slider to then subtly change the amount of darkening we've got, along with the opacity, of course, we can change. But now we've got an adjustment that's darkened this side of the girl's face but hasn't given us this crazy increase in saturation. And if we do the same thing with our lightening curves, as we saw with this one, if we introduce a rather dramatic lightening curve, you've lost a lot of color. So doing the same thing with a hue saturation adjustment layer, this time blended to screen mode, and again, if I reset these settings, as we've applied it normally, and I've used the same mask on both of these versions, in the normal blender mode of screen, yes, we've lost a lot of color from the image, but again, if we just go in and bring back the saturation so that it looks realistic, and then we can subtly play with that lightening and darkening, and that gives us a very fine control. So we've managed to increase the brightness of the image and maintain the skin colour and the lip colour. But you'll also see that in some of these shadow areas we've got a little bit of a problem, so we would normally look at painting that out and not affecting that with the increase and decrease. But you'll see here that with the colour of the hair, it's maintained that beautiful colour in the hair, whereas in the normal curves mode the hair colour is really washed out. So our first tip with working with curves where colour rendition is critical, and you're looking at working with a model or something like that, and you want to maintain the colour integrity, we don't use a curves adjustment at all. We'll go to an HSL adjustment and use the blending modes and the adjustments available with saturation and lightness to maintain the colour. So that's our tip number 1. And just following on from that first tip, where we're doing some fairly subtle adjustments, such as in this instance changing the luminosity of the foreground and background, we're not really going to get into a major problem with those colour shifts. Now in this instance what I did was I made 2 adjustments. I made a slight lightening adjustment, and you'll see that it's a very subtle adjustment. It's not aggressive, and even though it's taken a little bit of the colour out of the girl's face, it hasn't dramatically affected it. And likewise with the background, I've used a darkening curve, and it's increased the saturation, but it's not really of a major concern. We've still managed to maintain the integrity of the image. So working with these curves adjustments where colour is critical, it's often better to use an HSL adjustment, but for a lot of the other situations a plain old curves adjustment works just fine. Now moving on from using the HSL layers to adjust colour critical images, we've got another option, and that's to use curves adjustments to get rid of a colour cast that's crept into an image. Now this image has had a lot of processing to try and bring out the colour and detail because it was taken in a rather foggy situation in Iceland, and there's an option where you can use a curves adjustment to neutralise a colour cast. But I've seen some people suggest another way to do that, and that is to use the image adjustments and match colour option, which throws up another option, and then you can neutralize colour. But I've found that very rarely works for me. It may work for you on other images, but when I try it on multiple images it just doesn't work, so we won't use that. But what we will do is we'll create a new curves adjustment layer and use the power of the auto adjustment. And if you've seen the previous video, you'll know that if you hold down the Alt key while clicking on auto, it brings up a number of different options. Now I normally work with enhance monochromatic contrast and snap the neutral midtones, and by switching on and off these different options you'll see that you get quite a different effect. Find dark and light colors, enhance brightness and contrast, and enhance the monochrome contrast. And with each of these you can find usually an option that works for you. The brightness and contrast enhancement works pretty well, but I think I still prefer to work with that enhanced monochromatic contrast. And if we save that as a default, every time we go into that curves adjustment, that's what we get. And if you find that then the color is looking right but it's still a little bit dull, you can always just add another curves adjustment and just, let's say, use the default linear contrast option to just give that a little bit of a contrast boost. So I find that using the curves auto setting works much better for me. And let's look at another one, another image that's had a lot of processing applied to it to bring out fine detail and subtlety. This is from the whaling station at Grytviken on South Georgia Island. These are the old abandoned whale chasing ships. And again, if we try and use that image adjustment and match color option, I find that it gives me a very cool result, which is not what I wanted at all, and I don't use that. So what I did do is I went and applied a curves adjustment, used the auto setting, and it has given me a much better result. It's brightened the image up slightly, and it's also enhanced the color balance. even more. So tip number 2 is using the curves and the auto settings. And again, if you find that the default settings don't work for you, try using some of these other ones. See now, for instance, that's given us a very blue result. The light and dark colours has made very little difference. The brightness and contrast is dramatically increased, and that might work well as well. So by all means, try these and find the one that works for you. So now moving on from using curves to correct colour cast in an image, let's have a look at this image from the south coast of New South Wales, where what I wanted to do was just subtly affect the tonality of some parts of the image. And we can do that by making a curves adjustment and using the selection tool to identify subtle parts of the image. Now, these parts here I thought could possibly be a little darker. So if I move my eyedropper and click, I pin a point on the curve, and by adjusting that point, and I'm just going to drag that down, you'll see that it's dragging down these tones, but it's also affecting all the other tones, and that is because it's introducing a curve right across here. So if I just go to the middle point of the curve and bring that back up so that the middle tone is now exactly mapped to where it was, all I'm doing now is subtly affecting some of those darker tones, and I can even isolate that a bit more by adding another point on that curve, so that all I'm really doing is adjusting those darker tones. And I can do this with multiple adjustments, and all I need to do is just keep adding points to a curve so that I can selectively adjust the areas that I've got concern with, and I don't even need to make a mask. So that's a feature of curves that just doesn't apply to any other form of adjustment in Photoshop. So having another look at those adjustments, let's choose another image, this one from Torres del Paine in Chile. Again, wanting to just selectively lighten some of these darker areas of the image. I've made a number of points using this selection tool and picking out some of those darker points on the curve. I can just keep clicking and adding these points, and then very subtly starting to just change the tonality of those parts. But you'll see if I start to push things too far, I start to introduce some really weird things on the curve, and it's better if I turn the adjustment layer on so we can see what we're doing. But you'll see here that if I start going too far, so we've got to be fairly mindful that really what we want to do is we just want to adjust some areas very subtly. And you'll see there that I've just adjusted that middle range of tones here by selecting some very particular points and adding them to the image. And I've just lightened some of these darker points on the mountains as well. So using multiple points on a curve, provided you're very subtle with it, can make a huge difference to areas that just want a little bit of fine adjustment. Now, moving on from lightening and adjusting particular parts of an image, we've got a technique that works really well with a common problem, and that is in this image taken in Greenland of some icebergs. The lighting was very poor, and what's happened is that we've lost a lot of detail in the highlight areas, and there's a technique here we can use to subtly bring back some detail in blown out highlights, and it even works with particular images where there's no detail at all. But let's try this image, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the selection tool to choose what euphemistically is called a color range, but in fact we're going to use it to select highlights in an image. And you'll see here in this preview window that it's now selecting most of the image. I really only want to select the brightest part. So if I move my range all the way up towards the right and reduce the fuzziness, which is selecting areas outside the specified range, I'm really looking at these parts of the tops of the icebergs, and that looks like it's pretty close to what I want. So I make a selection now of that area, and you'll see here that there's quite a lot of areas that are not fully selected. What we can do now is just use the select modifying tools, select, modify, and expand and we're just going to expand it by 3 pixels, just a small amount. You'll see now that it's opened up that area into a little bit more. And then what we do with that selection made, we click on a new curves adjustment layer, and you'll see now that what's happened is, and if I hold down the Alt key and click on the mask, you'll see that it's affected quite a broad range of the image. We're really only wanting to affect the brighter tones. So let's just go back to the image adjustment, and what we need to do here is we don't need to make a curves adjustment at all. We just need to change the blend mode, and we'll blend it to multiply. Now at this point it looks pretty horrible because it's got a fairly specific adjustment, a selection. I want to feather that out quite a bit using the feathering adjustment, somewhere not quite as feathered as that, something like that. And it's brought back a lot of detail in those highlights, but it's just a little bit too overdone. So what do? We reduce the opacity until we get just the effect we want, which is just bringing back some subtle detail into those highlight areas. And using this to recover highlights in an image is a very powerful tool. And looking at another example of how we can use curves to recover highlights, a typical example would be something like a waterfall situation with a long exposure where we've got some fairly bright highlight areas that look as though they might be blown out. And what we can do again is to use that selection tool, select color range, and selecting the highlights, and then adjusting our range and fuzziness so that we're just picking up these very bright areas. You can see here they look as though they're blown out. Again, we've got a fairly selective area. I'm not going to modify that in this case. Let's just go and add a curves adjustment. The mask is added automatically, and let's just change our blend mode to multiply. You'll see now that it's brought back those highlights, but we've got a bit of a sharp edge. So by alt clicking on our mask, you can see the selection of the color range or highlights is very specific, and we want to soften that edge. So let's just move the feathering tool, and the beauty of doing it this way is that you can adjust the amount of feathering to suit. You don't have to decide beforehand. Let's just make that fairly soft on the edge. Alt click again to turn that off, and you can see here that the effect is very subtle. And again, of course, if you want to modify it, just use that opacity tool to bring back the adjustment and make it a little more subtle. But this is fantastic for bringing back blown out highlight detail. And going from restoring highlights in our image using the curves blended to multiply, we can go back and look at another way we can use curves to subtly adjust the tonality. And without using selected points on a curve, we can just again use our selection tool, and we can select the darker areas. In this instance, the people in the distance here that are used for scale are just a little bit dark. I want to lighten them. So we can go into our selection tool, go back to our color range. This time we're going to choose shadows, and we'll adjust the range and the fuzziness so that we're really just picking out those people. Let's just click OK. We've now got a selection that includes the people and a little bit of the foreground. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but let's go in now and add another curves adjustment. And you'll see here, if I click down on Alt, I've largely got my people selected. I've got a little bit of the foreground. Let's just see how that works. And what I'm going to do, instead of blending it to multiply, I'm going to blend it to screen to lighten the tones. And let's just zoom in on this, and let's just have a look at the effect. It's certainly lightened things. It's lost a little bit of contrast. So let's go in here and look at the selection. It's quite specific. So let's just go back and feather that a little bit so that we've got a bit of subtlety. And now it's working a lot better. And I can just adjust that back so that I don't lose too much of my detail. Again, these people are pretty small in the frame, but by using that subtle selection, I've lightened the foreground. Well, I don't really want that changed, but I want to keep it on the people. So the easy way to fix that is we just go to our brush tool, select black as our foreground color, and let's paint it in at 100% opacity because we just want to eliminate these areas. I don't want to affect the foreground at all, and using a fairly large brush I can paint these areas out fairly quickly. Once we get close to the people though, we're going to need to be a little more subtle. We'll need to zoom in, and we'll need to bring our brush size down so that we're not affecting those people at all. And we can just isolate that from the selection. Go back to Alt and click on that mask again. Yes, that's working pretty well. Let's go back to fill the frame, and we can see that we've got quite a subtle adjustment, and we've lightened things a little bit. So using a curves adjustment, we can recover highlights. We can also lift the darker tones quite simply using a selection and a color range and a blend mode. So we've looked at 5 additional ways we can use curves to help restore color in our images, control blown out highlights and blocked up shadows, and generally to target adjustments. So I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.